Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're reasonably on target. This is awesome. And I thank you all who have consumed your coffee and eaten your bagel outside. This is wonderful. Thank you very much. At this time, I would like to turn control of the colloquium over to Michael Shifter. Michael?
Thank you very much, Jay, and good morning to everybody. It's an enormous pleasure to be here, and the Inter-American Dialogue is extremely pleased and honored to be one of the sponsoring institutions of this colloquium. And for me, it's personally a great pleasure to be here and to chair this opening session, opening panel of the conference, or the stage setting panel, which will set the stage for what looks like is an excellent first-rate program today and tomorrow. I'm particularly pleased to do this because I have the pleasure of introducing and moderating a session with three close friends and colleagues for whom I have enormous regard and really have a lot to say about this issue, all from different perspectives, which I think will end up being very rich and stimulating session. Ambassador Luigi Einaudi will make some opening remarks. I think I'm surely not the only one in this room, I'm sure, who has benefited over many years from his Luigi's vast knowledge and deep insights about hemispheric affairs. He currently is a distinguished senior fellow here at the Institute, and he has had a very impressive career. I'm not going to go through his biography since you have copies of it, but what I think it's important to underscore is that he's somebody who I think uniquely has served for many, many years in the State Department, for the United States government, and at the same time has had very deep engagement in multilateral affairs, having been elected Assistant Secretary General of the OAS, and also was acting Secretary General of the OAS for a while, and he was also the U.S. Ambassador to the OAS. So he combines the multilateral with the U.S., and he also combines action. He's been involved in a lot of very, very important issues in resolving conflicts, including the Peru-Ecuador conflict in 1998, and as well as reflection. He's written extensively and has contributed enormously to all of our understandings about hemispheric affairs. And Luigi will provide some opening comments and remarks to get things going and to provoke all of us, which he always does. Let me just introduce the two other commentators who will also share their thoughts on these issues. Dan Fisk, also a good friend and colleague for many years. Dan is, again, quite unique in that he had worked in the White House, the National Security Advisor during the Bush administration, George W. Bush administration, and he's also been in the State Department, he's been in the Defense Department. He's worked on 4 congressional staffs, so he knows the perspective better than anybody from Congress, from the executive. He worked for a while for the Heritage Foundation, and he currently is the Vice President for Policy and Strategic Planning at the International Republican Institute, and he certainly has followed hemispheric affairs as closely as anyone, so we're delighted to have Dan be one of the discussants. He will make some comments after Luigi's presentation. And then finally, Carlos Portales, another very, very good friend and colleague who also sort of bridges different worlds. A very well-known scholar in international affairs. He worked for many years at Flaxo in Santiago, Chile. He's published extensively. And then he has devoted his time both to being Chilean ambassador to the Organization of American States. He was Chilean ambassador in Mexico, and has also been very, very involved in multilateral issues, including the Summit of the Americas and other issues as well. So he really also straddles lots of different worlds. So we really have three really exceptionally qualified people to lead us off. Before I give the floor to Luigi, let me just reflect for 1 second and maybe make two comments, and then we'll get started. Since we're recognizing anniversaries here, and this is the 10th year for the Declaration, 15th year for this colloquium. It also happens to be the 30th year for the Inter-American Dialogue. We're celebrating 30 years for the organization, and when anniversaries are a time to take stock, and so we're taking stock of what's happened over the last 30 years in inter-American affairs. And 30 years ago, during the Cold War, I'm sure my colleagues here are too young to remember this, but we talked a lot about the guerrilla conflicts in Central America, and talked a lot about coups and military rule and issues like that. And today, the agenda has shifted, and we're talking about crime that's in large measure fueled by the drug problem, conflicts over resources, and of all things, which nobody could have possibly imagined, the consequences and possible effects of economic contagion from, of all places, Europe. I don't think 30 years ago when we got together we thought that we'd be confronting that situation. So the world has changed, and no better person to tell us more about that than Luigi Einaudi. Luigi?
There we go. All right. I was thanking the audience, the participants, for being here, Michael for a very generous introduction, Dan and Carlos for joining me in this adventuresome effort. I intend to make 4 points about the Americas and the world, and then discuss some policy implications for us. The world is unsettled and fragmenting. The Cold War organized the world into blocks. 2 blocks, often referred to as East and West, so dominated the international scene that some countries created a non-aligned movement in an attempt to promote their interests independently of the Cold War. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the President of the United States, for once, really did articulate the hopes of many when he called for the emergence of a new international order. But the quarter century since then has brought little, if any, progress in that direction. There are now several power centers outside the United States and the former Soviet Union. But Europe and China are in flux and inwardly focused, and while Japan continues stable, and while Brazil, India, and some of the rest are certainly rising, all have their limits. Multilateral institutions continue to be associated more with inefficiency than with order. International law has been weakened by both war and failures to ratify treaties or abide by their obligations. Economic globalization now evokes uncertainty and fears of instability more than hopes for sustained development. The European Union, once the world's model for regional integration to end the risk of war, has generated centrifugal forces that threaten to tear it apart. Important socio-political factors, the expression of previously suppressed grievances, and the rise of non-governmental actors, the organizational and informational impact of new technologies, the decline of traditional programmatic political parties, the challenges posed by terrorism after 9/11 have all added to the difficulties encountered by governments as they try to adjust to these new stresses. The title of a recent book makes the basic first point well. Traditional assumptions of superpower dominance and legal order are out. We are living in no one's world. My second point is that the United States is weakened, but still very powerful, though inward looking. Looking at the Americas makes clear that any supposed decline of the United States is mainly relative to the rise of others. And even then, the change is more limited than often thought. A friend commented the other day that a few years ago, Brazil's economy was 1/10 that of the United States. Today, Brazil is hailed everywhere as one of the new emerging powers. Its economy is now 1/7 that of the United States. Assertions about the decline of the United States and accusations about who is responsible have become part of the controversy and polarization that mark U.S. domestic politics today. But I suspect Robert Kagan has it right in his essay in the New Republic. The whole message is in the title. Not fade away against the myth of American decline. Touching a different but similar vein that affects our conference, Micah Zenko and Michael Cohen argue in their Foreign Affairs article, Clear and Present Safety, that the United States is more secure than Washington thinks. Expressing similar uncertainties, a 2011 Woodrow Wilson Center essay prefaced by the current administration's first chair of the State Department's policy planning staff and written by someone with the purposely evocative pseudonym of Mr. Y, calls for a new strategic narrative for the United States now that the Soviet Union is no longer there to be contained. From the standpoint of the Americas, I would mention an additional note. Now that coups are mainly a thing of the past, what is available to read publicly in the United States is mainly about natural disasters and drug violence. Natural disasters are splashy but boring, and everything associated with drugs is so unhappy and controversial that, I at least often shut my eyes and pass on to the next article. But note something very important. This is not the only time or the first time that U.S. domestic politics has dominated an issue important to our neighborhood. Think of gun trafficking, think of Cuba, or think of immigration. In short, my second point is that seen from Latin America, the United States seems an uncertain, if sometimes necessary, partner. My third point is that the other Americas are developing economically and dividing geopolitically. Friendly neighbors are a key foundation of national power. During the Cold War, Canada and Mexico, what in Spanish would be called the países limítrofes of the United States, were friendly and did not require much attention. For years, the votes of Canada, Latin America, and after its independence, Commonwealth Caribbean, were generally supportive of the United States in the United Nations. This greatly facilitated the projection of U.S. power globally, but it did not particularly facilitate U.S. understanding of its neighbors. Except for the Alliance for Progress and the superimposition of the Cold War onto local conflicts to our south, Washington paid little attention. Today, South America in particular is largely unseen here. Its countries are not drought-ridden or impoverished. They have no interest in war on each other or on us. And with a few notable exceptions, they harbor no enemies of the United States. Democratization has proved resilient enough to push the debate toward democracy's quality rather than its desirability. Economic and social progress is still uneven, but increasingly real and broadly distributed. In fact, growth over the past decade has substantially reduced poverty, shifting the focus of voter demands on governments from income and jobs to health, education, public services, and crime. These generalizations are broadly valid, but the countries of Latin America are still very diverse. These days, in fact, it is critical to discuss subregions as well as individual countries. The rise of subregional organizations is important because they express more than just the ties developing among immediate neighbors. They also express a tectonic drifting apart of Central and North America and the Caribbean from South America. The small countries of Central America and the Caribbean are sometimes referred to as the third border of the United States. This is an apt description, for they are, for the most part, as closely linked to the United States as are Mexico and Canada. South America, meanwhile, remains extremely diverse, but is becoming economically and psychologically more distant from North America. Its current countries are carving out roles for themselves from the South Atlantic to the Pacific, and from Africa to China and the Middle East. Which brings me to the fourth point. The hemisphere cannot be insulated from global events. International ties, hostile to the United States, are an important part of Venezuela's controversial course over the past decade. But Venezuela is not alone in seeking improved ties outside the hemisphere. Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Peru, other countries are diversifying not only their production and trade, but their political relationships. And Americans from the United States often tend to forget that Canada and the English-speaking Caribbean are all members of the British Commonwealth. The most telling point is that in 2003, Mexico and Chile were both non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council, and they both voted against authorizing military action against Iraq, making clear that our neighbors were no longer part of a privileged preserve or backyard for the United States. Brazil's poorly handled attempt with Turkey to redirect Iran's nuclear program showed that these countries are prepared to act on the world stage. So, question. As Latin American and Caribbean countries expand the range of their diplomatic and commercial interests, Do they create opportunities or concerns for the United States? Well, there is one clear advantage for the United States. The expanded presence of other powers can reduce asymmetry, or to use less academic language, take pressure off accusations that the United States is always to blame for whatever the current disaster is. On a more practical level, there can be no doubt that China's hunger for commodities has helped fuel growth in many South American countries over the past decade. But there are also concerns. A key one is rise in opportunities for mischief by powers and groups unfriendly to the United States. No one of my generation will ever forget the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are some who fear Iran could create a similar threat. And then there is economic competition. Canada and Mexico quietly account for nearly a third of all U.S. trade. The rest of the Americas, less, but they have been the fastest growing regional trading partner for the United States during this past decade. The long-term risks of Latin America's globalization also include reduced opportunities for cooperation, both regionally and on the world stage. The ALBA countries, led by Venezuela, have consciously sought to create tension with the United States. This has reduced the effectiveness of inter-American cooperation at the OAS and put the regional focus on organizations that exclude the United States and Canada. We are really a long way from the days at Yalta when Joe Stalin told FDR that he wanted all 15 republics making up the Soviet Union to be admitted to the United Nations so that it would balance the expected pro-US automatic votes from Latin America. Yet, this is not a zero-sum game. This is no one's world. And because no one country can dominate, many can contribute. What adjustments in strategic thinking do these 4 points call for? Let me start with the United States. During my service on the Secretary of State's policy planning staff, during both Republican and Democratic administrations, a common assumption was that the United States is essential to the peace and prosperity of every region of the world. That viewpoint has not changed. The United States is a global power. The 2012 policy document that Frank Morra cited earlier, Priorities for 21st Century Defense, explicitly leads with sustaining U.S. global leadership. What may need to change in the future is that our strategy will have to be more explicitly linked to our own needs. In the past, and still today, we tend to formulate strategy globally and as a function of others, the containment of the Soviet Union, or the containment of China in Asia, or of Iran in the Middle East. A new strategic narrative will need to temper the global with the geopolitical. An article in Foreign Policy magazine earlier this year commented that, quote, the United States is applying its counterterrorism policy in Yemen. It does not have a policy for Yemen. Now, Yemen is far from the Americas, but the comment is worth pausing over. Is it enough to have a global policy, or is it necessary to know how to apply it in specific situations, cultures, regions, and countries. At this point in our discussion, let me just say, I think it's a big mistake, even for a global power like the United States, to ignore geography and not take neighbors seriously. Now, if the United States would do well to think a bit more about its neighbors, the opposite tends to be true for the other countries of the Americas. Generally speaking, they need to think less about the United States and more about themselves. The Caribbean Basin countries need to think more also about each other. Central American countries in particular need to muster their own resources. Nothing has been more debilitating to the ability of the United States to cooperate in Central America than our sense that they are not helping themselves. That is why SICA is so important. It symbolizes their willingness to cooperate with each other against the criminal cartels that always look for the weakest link. Almost 30 years ago, in the bad old days of the Central American conflicts, the National Bipartisan Commission on Central America concluded that coordination and common rules among the region's countries make it easier for everyone, including the United States, to cooperate with them. A year ago, I wrote that the United States and Brazil needed to improve their strategic engagement, and that would require, and I quote myself, I ask for forgiveness, the United States must welcome Brazil's emergence as a global power, recognizing that it is culturally and politically close to the United States, and for Brazil, in turn, to realize that the United States accepts its rise and that more can be achieved working with Washington than against it. A question often heard in Latin America is, okay, but does Washington want to work with us? Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta gave his answer in the Miami Herald article last week, already cited here. Quote, the attitude of the United States was that it would have to act alone to guarantee the security of the hemisphere. That is no longer the case, nor is it our preference, because we are stronger when we work with other nations to advance peace and security. A cynic might say that the United States may be feeling a bit overstretched, but my own view is that the openness is opportune and welcome, regardless of the cause. Mr. Chairman, will you allow me 5 more minutes?
Of course. Even 6.
Thank you. Now we turn more to the heart of what more toward the specifics of what we have to discuss. The decade since the OAS Mexico conference was called to modernize the regional security system could be described, not entirely inaccurately, as a flight from the obligations of the Rio Treaty into a view of security so multidimensional and complicated as to make it difficult to operate. The emergence of non-traditional security matters has fueled a debate over what is security and what is defense. What is the threat? Who are you fighting? Is it an enemy? Are terrorists foreign or domestic? Military forces are trained to defend national sovereignty against external attack. They're not trained to deal with their fellow citizens. That is police work. In some countries, there's also a terrible legacy still with us, and unfortunately still with popular resonance left over from the Cold War, which associates military institutions with repression, on the one hand and with the United States on another. But please note something important here. Latin America has been moving away from both militarism and war for 2 generations. Despite Argentina's unrequited aspirations over the Malvinas Falklands, major territorial conflicts on the South American mainland have been resolved. Latin America is the world's foremost nuclear-free zone. Argentina and Chile joined Brazil some years ago in forswearing weapons of mass destruction. Demining under the auspices of the OAS has progressed to the point that Latin America is virtually free of anti-personnel mines. In testifying earlier this year on defense and today's assistance to Latin America, my colleague Jay Cope identified 3 different strategic logics for United States defense policy in the hemisphere. And I will quickly summarize what I think is a very sound argument. First, in North America, the strategic logic centers on conventional defense of our homeland against nuclear, aerospace, and sea-based threats, as well as military support to law enforcement agencies facing non-traditional threats. According to Cope, still, Mesoamerica and the Caribbean present a complex logic shaped by difficult past relations with Washington, anti-narcotics and anti-crime programs, the weakness of government institutions in small states with unstable pasts, the desire by some in the region and in the United States to keep the armed forces in psychological exile, and clearly responses to local government requests for engagement with their armed forces on public security matters must ensure that U.S. actions are part of an integral whole that supports democracy and avoids the militarization of law enforcement. South America presents a third and very different situation. There, the key is learning to cooperate with countries prepared or interested in cooperating with us. Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Peru. The need there is to move away from traditional bilateral assistance-based relations to more institutionally based consultation and exchanges of information and technology. So, quickly now to some conclusions. First, future relations will take place in a global, not a hemispheric context. Second, geopolitics still matters, probably far more than most people realize. Third, effective policies will have to harmonize global with regional concerns and take into account subregions and individual nations as well as multilateral and bilateral concerns. We will have to get used to increased policy complexity and longer timelines. Collective global action has been out for some time, but cooperation is of necessity, given the transnational or multinational nature of problems that the world faces. 5, international law and institutions are critical to effective cooperation. For example, going back again to my analysis of the US and Brazil, both of us need to develop and sustain bilateral relations with other countries in accordance with our respective interests, of course. But both Brazil and the United States should actively support inter-American institutions like the OAS that bring both of them together with other countries of the hemisphere. Most other countries of the hemisphere want good relations with both. And multilateral forums provide an ideal ground to develop common rules. And if I may note something, multilateral organizations also help to offset the asymmetry of power between the bigger and the smaller. Brazil would do well to realize that asymmetry is beginning to bedevil its relationships in South America as it grows more rapidly than most of the countries around it. 6, the use of force must be legitimized by the rule of law. Michael Shifter has just put together a report for the Council on Foreign Relations on Central America that concludes the United States should minimize the role of foreign military assistance. I think that's right, because the issue is not a military one, but the military should also not be shunted aside, and when they participate, they must do so with a full awareness, even of self-imposed red lines not to be crossed. There are issues of jurisdiction and rights that are fundamental. 7, staying with the Shifter report. It's not the Shifter report, but that's all right. He wrote it for the most part. The United States should temper domestic policies that aggravate criminal violence in Central America. The report mentions reductions in demand for drugs, arms sales, and criminal deportations. It could also mention, in my view, money laundering and tax policies. But here's the central point I want to make. Discussions among us that lead to asking the United States to do something, stop letting that iron river of weapons to cross into Mexico, inevitably raise psychological hackles in the United States. Why is it always the U.S. that's being asked to do things? Sometimes without realizing, because we find it hard to realize that our own behavior is in fact contributing to the problem. This is a destructive dynamic. It's linked to national pride, asymmetric power, and lack of cultural self-awareness, really on both sides, and we need to be aware that we have those devils. 8th, and finally, even if we get our respective demons in order, it's important for Americans, for can-do Americans, that in crisis situations, it's difficult for outsiders to contribute positively unless local leaders are showing the way and defining the terms of cooperation. Thank you very much. Sorry for taking so long.
Thank you very much, Luigi, for those very, very stimulating comments, and got us off to a fantastic start. Dan?
Great, thank you. Good morning. It's a pleasure to see many friends in the audience and be back amongst you. Let me start with the Washington disclaimer, since I'm now in the NGO world, that the views that you hear today are my personal views, not those of the organization, the International Republican Institute, that I currently work with. Given that this panel is the stage setter, scene setter, I was asked to focus on the realities of the United States, so I'm going to acknowledge that this is a U.S.-centered perspective, building in some cases off of what Luigi has presented. Also, I'll acknowledge up front some of the things I will say are not news, but hopefully I'll give them some context and perspective as it relates to the topic. First, I agree very much with Luigi's analysis that the United States is at a point where it is inward-looking, and maybe in some cases more inward-looking today than it has been over the last 30 years. The first and foremost reason for that is the concerns, continuing concerns over the state of the U.S. economy, either in terms of the reality of the economic circumstance or the perceptions. The region feeds into that in the sense that there are mixed perceptions of whether the Western Hemisphere contributes to our economic well-being or works to our economic detriment. There is still a significant hangover from the last 10+ years of an aggressive trade policy. And a lot of this centers around the question, does trade with Latin America create jobs or take jobs? Associated with the economy is the circumstance with the U.S. government budget in terms of the concerns about where we are in ability to sustain the budgetary outlays that are before us, not to mention sustain the outlays that are projected over the next decade or more. What happens in that debate is something we have seen repeatedly as far as the political process, and that is to use foreign aid as the main topic of the discussion when it comes to any kind of foreign policy aspect. This has been a constant in American policy. It tends to be managed at times, but I think we're at a unique moment where foreign aid is even a higher topic in terms of the level of concern. It goes along with the continuing American belief that we spend a lot more internationally than we really do. And at this point, I think there's also the element whether or not aid relationships create or continue commitments that we simply cannot afford. Especially you're in a circumstance where the average American thinks roughly 25% of his tax dollars go overseas, basically as a giveaway, and therefore for politicians it is a no-lose proposition to have that as a continuing target. Related to this as well, or interconnected, is I think that there is a continuing fatigue that has come out of what has been known as the global war on terror or the war on terror, and definitely the U.S. military presence in Iraq and Afghanistan. I say this not to make any judgments on those. I'll let the historians deal with that, but I think there is a general fatigue in the issue of regarding foreign policy generally. We've seen it in so far our own campaign season. I think we'll see it less, in which there'll maybe be one focus specific at one time on foreign policy, and the rest will go back to a Clintonian era. It's about the economy, stupid. Third element, Americans, even without these first two, Americans are still conflicted on the importance of the region to the United States. Americans fundamentally think in East-West terms. They think about the War of 1812, to play off what Jay mentioned. They don't think about the Spanish-American War or the war with Mexico in the late 1840s. They think of Asia, specifically China. They think of the Eurozone, but it is hard to find that there are, other than episodic focus on the region. And of course, this does vary. If you talk to a Floridian, a South Floridian, as opposed to a Panhandle Floridian, you will get one perspective if you talk to someone along the southwest border. But overall, you find out this is very, very unique to or specific to U.S. regions. Compounding this are issues and mixed feelings towards immigration. I think it's fair to say that there remains an undercurrent. I don't think it's just on one side of the political spectrum in terms of immigration and, frankly, concerns about the Hispanization of American society. Americans do tend to forget that we were once concerned about the Germanization of American society or the Italianization of American society or the Southern Europeanization of American society. We've seen these before, but nonetheless there are these currents that are there. But while there's this general view, when you get down to the individual migrant who works in your church, your school, or your next door neighbor, then there's the 14 million exceptions that overwhelms the 14 million person rule. But nonetheless, this all plays into, again, this uncertainty regarding where the region fits into the interest of the United States. In addition, or feeding this is that, in my view, and this has not really changed, the region is still more bad news to the average citizen and member of Congress than good news. In preparing for this, I went through roughly the last year or more of congressional statements on Latin America. And also then kind of matching that a little bit with the press, and no surprise, you'll see that there's a correlation. But if you take out all the words that have been spilled on Cuba, basically you are left with a hemisphere that comes across in these vignettes: gruesome violence in Mexico and perceptions of significant spillover into the United States, a widespread crime and a general unraveling of societal structures in Central America, nationalizations in Argentina, political uncertainty in Venezuela, actions against the press in Ecuador, continuing human interest stories, mostly of suffering that come out of Haiti or the failures of international and U.S. assistance specifically to reestablish some sense of normalcy in that country, and Iranian influence or activities in the hemisphere. So as a vignette for the average citizen and average member of Congress, it is still a region seen of general terms of instability, migration, violence, drugs, and now we have the added image of mullahs on America's doorstep. Let me make a comment what I don't think that some of the actions and some of these perceptions are not a function of. I do not think that they are a function or impact of divided U.S. government. Sometimes people want to be able to look at the U.S. government and say how you have one party in power and one branch and another. Thus, it is an issue of divided government. That is not necessarily the case. We've now had divided government more often than not for the last 3 decades. Very few periods of united government. Also, I will disagree with Luigi on this one, and I have given lots of thought to this, is that I do not think it's a function of a lack of U.S. attention on the region. In fact, I think that is too easy to default to, and it is all of us who worked on Latin America have fallen prey to that at various times. Actually, if you look back at it, I would submit that the region has received a fair amount of attention vis-a-vis other regions of the world by U.S. policymakers, maybe not by the American public, but by U.S. policymakers. I'm frankly prepared to argue whether the type, timing, or intensity of the attention and how that impacted, but it is the region has received, in my views, significant attention, sometimes, frankly, more than the region has merited. And I will give you, I think, one of the most vivid examples is if you think about American foreign policy in the post-Vietnam era, the one country outside of Israel that has received the greatest largesse of the American taxpayer and received the most sustained attention is Colombia. It is something where we have been involved. And it is one of those that, yes, we've had policies towards Asia, we've had other regional policies, but nothing on the magnitude of Colombia in terms of our ability with our short-term attention span problems to focus on one issue. Now, I say that recognizing that quite often Latin America is effectively the proverbial political football that both parties seek to kick when the opposition party sits in the White House. I think it's fair to say that no other geographic region and no other set of U.S. officials who work on a region have been subjected to the level of partisan scrutiny over a sustained period of years as either the region, the Western Hemisphere, or the officials who work on the hemisphere. I think, though, this has had a cumulative effect on our policy and on American perceptions of the region, not necessarily to our benefit. Another element impacting this is the region itself is its own behavior, and Luigi raised some of these, and in some cases I will find myself in agreement with him. First, there is this mythology that there is something unitary called, quote-unquote, Latin America. I think really when we look back on it, it has existed in our imagination or as a rhetorical device, but the whole hemisphere has engaged in it. But it has led to certain underpinnings